romance. Romance novels have been around since like the 1740s, Pamela being the first notable one. And since then, they've been hot topics and hot reads by many a woman. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think romance novel, I instantly think Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen. It's a classic. It ends happily. There's the enemies to lovers trope. There's marriage. Just all in all, a good, kind of exciting read that gets what you need. Love, marriage, and something that fuels both parties equally. But this is an old one. 18th century. Love is kind of the epitome of any young girl's life, and trying to make it out of the deep despair that is middle classness and marry up. Enter in, a couple centuries later, Colleen Hoover. It ends with us. Super viral on TikTok, or Book Talk as it's been lovingly penned, and really got kind of the whole world out of a pandemic and sadness. But how does he do it? Now, It Ends With Us isn't necessarily a happy novel. I cried many a time whilst reading it. But it makes you feel things in a way that maybe Pride and Prejudice doesn't. So how are these two very different novels a part of the same genre? And are they kind of the same? Let's talk about Pride and Prejudice, a novel from 1813, a novel that eventually revolutionized all of women's fiction for everyone. And the domestic novel was kind of birthed out of this one. Described on the Jane Austen Society of North American website, Pride and Prejudice is described as a classic love story, and its assumption that love is healthy, that love can actually improve a person's character, that people of integrity understand the importance of love in a marriage, that their capacity to love is a measure of their integrity. That's a lot. That's a lot that this novel tries to do, and it's a lot that this novel tries to argue love does. But as the domestic novel kind of came to arise for women everywhere, women were finally allowed to see themselves written by themselves and written for themselves. Pride and Prejudice is a pretty straightforward plot. You know, you've got the 5 Bennet sisters. One marries well, one marries not well, one marries kind of average, and one's kind of destined to be at home for the rest of her life. And then you have Elizabeth Bennet. Elizabeth is just the pinnacle of all damsels, but she's not in distress. She's independent and strong-willed and witty and humorous and doesn't really just want to get married to the first guy she sees because it's convenient. She actually hates Darcy after meeting him for the first time and then kind of betrays that hate and ends up marrying him after seeing what kind of a great guy he actually is and how this love for her saved him. And that in and of itself probably gave women a lot of hope for the future, and a lot of hope that marriage doesn't necessarily have to be this strange, arranged thing that gets you further in society, but it can be on the basis of love, and it can actually make you a better person. You get kind of all you need out of Pride and Prejudice. You know, there is conflict in the daughters wanting different things, and then Lydia and Wickham happens, and that is a capital D drama, and we are at risk of ruining the family's name. And you have Elizabeth, who marries so far outside of their social capital and elevates the family into a different class completely. You have the courtship that is Darcy trying to be super masculine and aggressive and kind of falling into those tropes. But you also have his undying love for Elizabeth. And that duality of Darcy, I think, is what makes him so attractive to the reader. You know, you have this cold, heartless kind of guy who doesn't really care for marriage and doesn't see that for himself until he meets Elizabeth Bennet, who is just everything he wants and more, and everything he didn't know he wanted. And he turns into this kind of lovable guy, and he is rich when it doesn't hurt. He is supposed to be like the most eligible guy around, and when he finally professes his undying love for Elizabeth, it's supposed to be completely swoon-worthy and supposed to sway all of the readers and Elizabeth, and it does eventually. That just creates this euphoric and utopian idea of love that really just is simple and enjoyable and just easy to consume. So how did this one get to be so popular and so prominent and just kind of the center of all things holy in the world of literature, and how has it survived 2 centuries? I think that the sheer duality of Darcy is what makes this such a driving novel. And James Sherry, a scholar, agrees with me. He says that there seems to be a general agreement that the essential impulse of the novel is dialectical, and hence that both Darcy and Elizabeth must undergo some changes of heart and of opinion before the novel can reach its beautifully poised and profound resolution in their marriage. And it's so true. Like, neither Darcy or Elizabeth are perfect characters by any means. Elizabeth is kind of incredibly hateful for most of the novel, and Darcy is kind of insufferable for most of the novel. But you see both of their kind of demeanors and characters and personalities change as they grow to love one another, which is, I think, what gives a lot of this book hope. For example, if Lydia and Wickham had been our main protagonists, it'd be a completely different book. Lydia is childish and kind of impulsive and just kind of gets into this marriage with Wickham, who we know is an awful character and kind of has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. He's not even rich, at least Darcy is. And so it would have been a much sadder and kind of more straightforward in the sense of it would be a lot more representative of the dynamic of marriage being just a political and social ploy. And there's no fun, there's no romance in that. Alternatively, if the book had been about Jane and Bingley, I think we could have gotten somewhere, but with Jane and Bingley, the social classes, I feel like, are not extreme enough to make it seem worthwhile in reading. Bingley is wealthy, of course, but he's no Darcy. He's no kind of 18th, 19th century millionaire that Darcy brings to the table. And so there isn't that kind of unreachable quality that people just want to gravitate towards. There also is no tension between the two. They kind of like each other from the first glance, and we just kind of go on this trajectory of them falling deeper in love, if you can call it that. We don't really see a lot of insight into the relationship, but it seems like they just go more and more in love. He knows that she's the best at the ball. She knows that he is kind of the best available option for her. And so there isn't that push and pull that we feel with Elizabeth and Darcy. And Mary's average kind of marriage wouldn't have done anything for the contemporary reader, and especially not for current day readers. So just the sheer tension that is Elizabeth and Darcy's relationship is what makes it so palpable and so everlasting. I think that even modern day readers can relate to and want to chase after. And think about Darcy, created the hand flex, which is so prominent in all of period pieces that are drama today. We see it in Pride and Prejudice, we see it in Bridgerton, we see it kind of everywhere. If it's placed in the 18th, 17th, and 19th centuries, we see that just the sheer need to touch, but the incapability of actually that physical connection happening is what makes it so enticing and so enticing and makes you want to see how it ends and where it goes, and that the moment that the couple touches or admits their feelings to one another is just made that much stronger because you've been denied it for most of the novel or most of the content. And hey, it worked. Jane Austen has written many a novel, but Pride and Prejudice is one of her most talked about and most discussed. And I think it's because it's still so prominent, and we still, as a 2023 reader, as a 21st century reader, still are in search of that. Let's get into the basics about It Ends With Us. Where to begin? So this novel starts with Lily Blossom Bloom, and starts immediately following her father's funeral. She meets a guy who just happens to be a neurosurgeon, and she falls in love with him kind of immediately. It happens a lot faster than Pride and Prejudice, but in many ways very, very similarly to Pride and Prejudice. So I've kind of given the rundown of how and why Pride and Prejudice works so well and so efficiently as a novel, as a romance novel. So I'm just gonna kind of do a quick little parallel on It Ends With Us in relation to this one. I just want to start by saying that I should have seen this book coming and I didn't, which is interesting. Lily Blossom Bloom is kind of this seemingly independent, strong person who hates what her father did to her mom, and never wants that to be repeated. But in that, she is this fresh new insight from her mom's that differentiates herself from her mother. But she's also incredibly fragile, and she, pardon my pun, but blossoms into a new person by the end of the novel. And I think that Hoover does something really interesting with names, is that in that she tells you exactly what you're gonna get, and she chooses names that kind of embody the person's character and how they're going to influence the novel in a very good way. I've already discussed Lily, but also Ryle, which is a name that I kind of hated from the beginning, but I can understand where she was coming from in that I think riled up, which can allude to his kind of sexual ferocity, I guess, but also in his anger and the way that he can just explode at any given moment. Whereas Atlas is kind of Lily's guider and her map and leads her. He's her North Star. He leads her to safety and leads her to truly think about the situation she's in, and he's kind of this protective force that gets her out of trouble. So in that way, Hoover does something really on the nose, but also very smart in that she guides the readers to where they need to go before they recognize it, I think. So according to the Romance Writers of America, a romance novel has to have two basic elements. One, a central love story, and two, an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending. Obviously, Pride and Prejudice hits both of those criteria, check and check. You get the love story of many people, but centrally of Elizabeth and Darcy, and then you get the optimistic ending of them being married and her being able to send her sister money and them being super well off financially and emotionally, and then just being kind of life partners, which is great and I'd say optimistic. Meanwhile, you have It Ends With Us, which is a little bit trickier in how it fits those two criteria. First, you have this initial kind of baby romance that is Atlas and Lily in the beginning of the novel, or before the novel happens, that we learn about through her diary entries to Ellen. But the central and kind of driving love story that is It Ends With Us is between Ryle and Lily. And in many ways that Darcy can kind of pull at the heartstrings and is this kind of, for 18th, 19th century standards, this tortured soul and just needs to be free and wifeless because a marriage is just beneath him. Ryle is kind of the same. He is a rich neurosurgeon and he's a bad boy and he hates all relationships because he's tortured and damaged and doesn't want to embark upon this super common idea that is love. When Ryle first meets Lily, they have a conversation about why each person values the type of relationships they want, and Ryle sets up this narrative that he doesn't want to get married, but that like whenever he has a certain desire, there are just a line of girls waiting to satisfy his needs, right? And he says that, quote, "The thought of marriage repulses me," end quote. And then Lily is like, "Oh, crazy, like, do you want to be like super successful in life? Is that like what you're after?" And he tells her, "Anyone can have children, anyone can get married, but not everyone can be a neurosurgeon. I get a lot of pride out of that. And I don't want to just be a great neurosurgeon, I want to be the best in my field." And so you have this idea that there is a certain mundaneness to marriage, right, which he just doesn't want any part of. And I think to an extent Darcy is the same way at the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, in that they're both content with what they have, and marriage and love are not their first kind of signs of a successful life, until they meet the women of their dreams, which are Elizabeth and Lily. So in that vein, there is a familiarity that is Ryle because of Darcy. Very successful, very out of reach, kind of just the epitome of all things kind of out of Lily's grasp. And at first Lily doesn't want any part of it, much like Elizabeth. She knows that he's not what she wants, and she knows that they both have very different wants in life, and she rejects the beginnings of many Ryle's advances, until she doesn't, which Elizabeth also doesn't do. But for a good part of the novel, obviously not as long as Pride and Prejudice, but for a good part of the novel, she rejects his advances. But comparatively, just in the length of the novels, Pride and Prejudice is much more slow burn, obviously. And while you get the hand flex that is Pride and Prejudice, you get just so many a sex scene in It Ends With Us, which does that contribute to its popularity? Probably. But there is nothing, at least in like the physical relationship that is Ryle and Lily, there's nothing that's kind of out of the reader's imagination, because you're handed it so quickly. And I think that's one of the major differences between these two novels, in that Pride and Prejudice is all about just the purity of love and how much it can make a person grow, and is great for individuals when it is love at the foundation and the basis of it all. Whereas It Ends With Us obviously prioritizes just the physical connection and the sex of it all, or the smut of it all. And so you just have different prioritizations that manifest in different representations of love in a marriage. But does it have an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending? Yeah, I guess, but not in the way that you would expect. Pride and Prejudice, which I am establishing as just the holy grail of romance novels because it fits all the boxes so well and is just a blueprint of the genre, but is a much more straightforward representation of what a romance novel should be. You get the love, you get the marriage, we're done. Hopeful future, yay! Whereas It Ends With Us introduces a modern spin on it and makes you kind of work for the ending. Obviously, you understand what's happening at the end of the novel. That's not what I'm saying. Like, nothing's hidden very well in this novel. It's very just, here's what you get and you're gonna like it, you know? There's no analysis that needs to happen. It's just a straightforward read, and for that part, it's an easy read. But it does kind of turn the romance genre on its head, in that Ryle is not the best person for Lily, and he's not a great husband, and he has flaws that are kind of irredeemable, which Darcy doesn't have. Darcy is the epitome of perfection and just like the highest man pot like around, and is just an example of greatness, great male energy, that Ryle just betrays, you know? Like, Ryle is presented as this super successful, super loving, great guy who actually gets Lily for the first time, and they're supposed to have a great marriage. And Hoover kind of perverts that idea and makes him abusive and forces Lily to relive her mother's trauma and presents you with Atlas as the best alternative. And that's not saying that Atlas isn't like the greatest guy ever. Like, he is rich, he's successful, he understands Lily. What more could you need, you know? But in the sheer like comparison of it all, Ryle should be and is Darcy with a spin, you know? Like, other than being condescending or like a little haughty, Darcy doesn't have a whole lot of flaws. And Pride and Prejudice is regarded as a deep, deep insight into human nature and a representation of all things that are human. But a lot of the characters that we are supposed to like don't have gripping flaws. And I don't want to say that Colleen Hoover is just the best novelist around, but there is a certain tension within the characters themselves that does feel incredibly human. And especially during the time that it was popular, a lot of people needed that human connection. COVID was isolation, and you didn't see anyone other than your immediate family, and Colleen Hoover gave you deep characters with problems and made you want to fix something that was broken. And I think that the credit in that aspect should be given to Hoover. I do think that they're very similar novels. I think that It Ends With Us is Pride and Prejudice with a little extra drama, you know? And there is the idea that Hoover idealizes abusive relationships, which I don't think I agree with. But the ways that it is regarded does feel a lot less high art than Pride and Prejudice. However, we don't know what It Ends With Us is gonna be in a century. Like, if people will still be reading it, if it will still be prominent, if people will be discussing it in a college senior lit class. Like, we don't know what history is when we're living it. And I don't know that Colleen Hoover's novels are gonna be just the greatest representation of 21st century literature, but I don't know. Like, it made a whole community virtually, and it made people feel like they were a part of something, and it obviously affected people. And so there's got to be merit in that, at least a little bit. And it's still being sold, it's still being talked about. It's obviously not like a fly-by-night novel. Like, it was made popular during COVID, and 3 years later we're still talking about it. There's still merch for it. The coloring book that got canceled, but you can still buy things for it. And so within this modern lens, I think it adds something to society. And I don't know, I think that Pride and Prejudice and It Ends With Us, published 200 years apart, are more similar than they're different. When you look up It Ends With Us on Amazon, you are met with it being described as women's literature. But what the heck does that mean? Well, picture this. It's 1813. You're a woman. You want to read something. But you want to read something that's like for you. Stumble upon good old Pride and Prejudice. Yay! And you get this novel that talks about a woman's experience and isn't just immediately about like a woman falling in love with a guy because he's handsome and rich, but you actually get to see the struggle of that falling in love. Crazy. There's born a domestic novel. A domestic novel is one that represents a woman's complete experience and is a way, and in ways humanizes that experience, which I think It Ends With Us fits pretty well. As I discussed in my Pride and Prejudice presentation, Nancy Armstrong's Desire in Domestic Fiction kind of situates readers within women's fiction fiction or the domestic novel very well. The domestic novel was popularized in like the 18th century and was for women, and I think It Ends With Us fits that criteria like exceptionally well. Like, it's a novel written by a woman, obviously, but also it's a book with kind of, for the sake of the novel, well-rounded women characters, and you see the woman's experience. I think, especially as a child of domestic violence, the perspective of a woman incredibly well, and you see that people's characters matter. I think it could be very easy to write a novel like this in which Ryle is forgiven over and over again, and it would be a completely different novel, don't get me wrong, but like I think that there's a world in which you read this and Lily keeps forgiving Ryle time and time again because he loves her. But that's not what we get. We get a novel in which we see Lily recognize the goodness that is Ryle, but also recognize her own value over that of a man's. And in that way, I think that it contributes to this idea of the domestic novel quite well, in that you're seeing a woman choose herself when she should. And there's arguments that she doesn't choose herself, she chooses her daughter. I think she can choose both. But we do get a human-filled experience of the woman's experience, especially from the context of this novel. And I also think that the first person of it all helps a lot, in that we are experiencing her experiences firsthand, in a deeper way that Pride and Prejudice does. You get a lot of everyone's kind of thoughts and feelings and opinions. So you've just seen this trajectory and this evolution of the domestic novel, of being something that, yes, represents a woman and who she is for the larger public, but also situates her within this realm of society, and into this novel that is told from the perspective of the protagonist, and you follow her and you live with her for a good bit of time. And so with this kind of change of the romance novel, we also see a change of the domestic novel. Similarly, we can also associate It Ends With Us with Mary Jane Corbett's Cousins in Love. Now, bear with me. Pride and Prejudice is situated at a time when marrying cousins, like literally, was pretty common. But Mary Jane Corbett introduces this idea of endogamy versus exogamy, which It Ends With Us also represents pretty well, in that Lily is by no means poor, impoverished, under the poverty line, but she is no neurosurgeon, and she owns the whole top floor of an apartment building, like there is still that divide between Ryle's family and hers, and in that way exogamy is present, and as I argued before, that tension that makes you want to love Pride and Prejudice and love the relationship of Elizabeth and Darcy is present also in It Ends With Us, and that wealth and capitalism do a lot, I think, for a novel, but I think that in supplying these kind of fantasies of romance and better lives, social class and social mobility are still present in our contemporary media. And so just another element that is consistent and foundational in Pride and Prejudice is also present within It Ends With Us. But at the same time, you could argue that endogamy is also at play, in that Ryle and Lily's dad are incredibly similar, in that they're both kind of, not public figures, they're not both public figures, but they are outwardly very lovable characters and very kind, but they also have like darker sides to them. So like you could argue that endogamy is also at play, but I think by and large exogamy and the tension that is social mobility and social class divides is another driving force of It Ends With Us that is present in Pride and Prejudice. And just one more link between the two. Okay, we've got those. And then, furthermore, the Janice Rodney reading that we got in class, I think also situates both of these novels very well and why they matter and why they are both driving romance novels. On 212, she writes, romance reading supplements that avenues traditionally open to women for emotional gratification by supplying them vicariously with the attention and nurturance they do not often get of in the round of day-to-day existence. And so, simply put, any girl would, like, any, generally, and generalization forthcoming, but any woman, you know, who sits down and reads this novel would love for Darcy to come sweep her up and fall in love with her. But at the same time, the beginning half of the novel, Ryle, like part one Ryle, is just kind of stereotypically just the guy to have. He is big and strong, and he's smart, and he's rich, and he wants a lot of like success in life, and he has a great family, and is kind of just perfect until he's not. And so like that kind of perfection and the kind of untouchableness that is Ryle is what makes a lot of It Ends With Us so riveting for a lot of readers. Obviously, it didn't go over super well in our class, but I think that the everyday reader wants to be transported into a world that is kind of far out of the norm, but not impossible to attain, you know? And I think Ryle kind of embodies that. Like, he's obviously an everyday person. Like, we see doctors and smart people all the time, but he's just written to be so convincing and so special, and makes Lily feel all these things that are, of course, fictitious, but like that are spoon-worthy, I guess. And a lot of people derive simple pleasure out of that alone, which I think is the goal of a romance novel. Like, I don't think a romance novel is supposed to be groundbreaking and make you think about all of like humanity and the importance of existence and why we're all here. Like, I don't think that's the point of a romance novel. The point of a romance novel is to read a couple hundred pages and enjoy those couple hundred pages and come out at the end with like a love-filled relationship. And I think that It Ends With Us, while not as straightforward and not as clean and cut and dry as Pride and Prejudice, like, does that. You get a love story, you get a couple love stories as told through, once again, the Ellen Diaries, but you get a love story and you get a somewhat happy ending. Like, while it's not what you expect to be the ending of the novel when you first begin it, it is happy. And like the final line of the epilogue is, "You can stop swimming now, Lily. We finally reached the shore." Like, while Ryle is this kind of hunk of burning love, like, Atlas isn't too bad either. Like, he is this perfect demonstration of all things manly, in that he went to the military for 8 years, and he's a great chef, and he is rich in and of itself, and he has this undying love for Lily, and he moved to Boston just like he said he would, and like low-key the hopes of seeing her again. And so like you have this kind of fresh, innocent type of love that also is the driving force of the novel, and also something that the readers probably strive for in their everyday lives. And so in multiple ways, you get this readers living vicariously through Lily in many ways. And so yeah, there's that tension that also exists, and It Ends With Us that I think situates Pride and Prejudice super well as a romance novel, and I think is a big reason why both novels were so popular. Additionally, why Hoover's novel is so popular is the rise of social media. I don't know that without it, it would be regarded so widely, but it is. And I think that we have algorithms, or she has algorithms, to thank for that rise of popularity. in the Stacks article that was posted on Canvas, one of the essays by Danielle Fuller and Danelle Ribeiro points out that on Goodreads specifically, a major repeated line is that it's quite an easy read and one you can finish in a couple days, and that seems to be a positive thing, like a big thing for a lot of different readers, and a compelling argument to make. And so people kind of just want to chew through literature really quickly, and that's true for It Ends With Us. It's a fairly quick read. It's not necessarily difficult to understand, so you kind of get through it really quickly. And the two authors, Fuller and Ribeiro, continue saying, it is both a response to an implicit rhetorical cue. Is it pleasurable and an expression of value that is embedded within and sustained by the genre of social action, or is it worth my time? And the question of why is it so popular is kind of a straightforward answer, in my opinion, in that most of the world is on TikTok kind of all the time, or some sort of social media platform all the time. And when you are in this realm of so many users and everyone using the same platforms all the time, everyone's going to get the same content all of the time. Things are going to go viral to most of the world. And so you're just kind of in this kind of vacuum of just so much information, a limited amount of information. And so of course everyone's going to read Hoover because everyone's using the same platform all of the time, and everyone has access to the same amount of material all the time, and so it has to be repeated, and it has to, once something goes big on one person's page, it goes big on a second person's page. It's like a domino effect. And so just, of course, it's going to be super popular super quickly. I can only imagine what would have happened if Book Talk and BookTube and Bookstagram were things during Jane Austen's time. Of course, I don't know if it would have been regarded as widely and as highly as it is today, but in this kind of evolving nature of society, and that we're turning to a much more digital based society, of course those social media platforms are going to have huge effects on our consumption of media. And Claire Parnell's reading through Wattpad's classification and discoverability algorithms also just kind of further institutes that idea. And she says, in Book Talk, for instance, the emphasis on recommendation videos creates a focus on the material culture of bookishness and the performance of emotional connections to books. And so if you see people having strong reactions to something, then of course it's going to pique your interest. And if you see people actually love a piece of media, then of course you're going to want to try it for yourself. It works for one person, it should work for me. And so there is this just innate sense of community and kind of shared experience that I think also makes Colleen Hoover's novel so tempting and so desired, which I think to an extent, not to an extent, which I think Pride and Prejudice also does quite well. It's been around for centuries for a reason, and so people continue to go back to it. There are classes based on Austen. Will there be classes based on Hoover? She has enough novels to fit a whole semester, but I don't know. I think that human connection and shared experience, especially in a virtual climate, do a lot for an individual's opinions. And I also do think that it's incredibly important for scholars like the ones I listed before and quoted, but also Janice Rodney. Especially, I think it's incredibly important for scholars to continue to try to navigate this ever-changing kind of atmosphere of literature and not simply cast it off because it's basic literature. I think that there is value in It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. I think there is intellectual merit in it. It's someone's intellectual property, and it was created by someone's brain. And I think that for that basic reason, we should consider it with a little bit of critique, you know, like not in a necessarily like we have to make sure it's as awful as possible, but like positive critique also of like being able to look at it and analyze it for what it is and recognize that it has value, while also pointing out its flaws. I mean, I don't think it's perfect. I don't think Pride and Prejudice is perfect either. I don't think that what we're searching for in art and literature and any sort of media is perfection by any means. Like, I think the most basic goal of any sort of story is to make people feel things, and It Ends With Us does that. Even if that hate is, I mean, even if that feeling is hatred and just like repulsion, like I think it makes you feel a strong opinion, I think either way. And I think that that's incredibly important, and I think that could be the reason why it lasts and will last so long. You either kind of love it or you hate it, and I think there's a lot of value in either one of those opinions and either one of those feelings. And because of those strong and kind of visceral reactions, I don't know, maybe It Ends With Us is the modern day Pride and Prejudice. Who knows? Just keep swimming. But the novel keeps telling you to just keep swimming.